Welcome back to Mad Hatter's Civil War History. Today we check in on the understudy Battle of Cedar Creek and the valiant 8th Vermont. They were sent on a suicide mission at Cedar Creek, and their victory rallied the Union. The fierce clash proved to be a fitting coda for the resolute 8th Vermont. Howard awoke before dawn on October 19, 1864, to what he thought was thunder. The clamor, though, wasn't coming from the clouds, but from the fog enveloping the left flank of the Union Army of the Shenandoah at Cedar Creek, and the sounds accompanied a raging band of Confederate soldiers. It was like the howls of the wolves around the wagon train in the early days of the Great Prairies, he would write. Captain Howard and his comrades in the 8th Vermont Infantry had anticipated another fight at some point, just not in the dead of night. Confederate Lieutenant General Jubal Early, however, wasn't known to readily accommodate his opponents. The rebels' initial fog-shrouded thrust that morning was chaotic, as the sleeping Union troops were quickly overwhelmed, many choosing to flee, half-clothed, rather than to put up a fight. The retreat, recalled Captain D. Augustus Dickard of the 3rd South Carolina, was a living sea of men and horses. When the attack began, the Union Army's colorful commander, Phil Sheridan, was resting 12 miles away in Winchester. His subordinates on site scrambled to respond, fortunate to receive additional time when famished Confederates stopped mid-attack to pilfer food and supplies for the Union camps. Among those trying to make sense of the situation was Brigadier General William H. Emory, the 19th Corps commander. Knowing he was ordering a likely suicide mission, Emory directed 8th Vermont Commander Colonel Stephen Thomas to engage Brigadier General John B. Gordon's attacking Confederates head-on. Gordon's division totaled roughly 2,000 troops. Thomas, in command of the 2nd Brigade that day, had about 800 from 4 regiments, including the 8th Vermont. Meeting again on the Cedar Creek battlefield 19 years later, Emory grasped Thomas's hand and reflected, "I never gave an order in my life that cost me so much pain as it did to order you across the pike that morning. I never expected to see you again." Formed in 1862, the 8th Vermont quickly developed a sterling reputation for bravery. Thomas, Howard, and Captain Moses McFarland were but a few of the regiment's eventual list of standouts. Thomas, gray hair sprinkled throughout his dark beard, was a 51-year-old state representative with no military experience when the war broke out. A Democrat, he was hand-selected to lead the regiment. Howard had enlisted as a sergeant in Townsend, Vermont, and received a Medal of Honor for heroism during the 1863 Bayou Teche campaign. McFarland would be one of the 8's heroes at Cedar Creek. A 43-year-old father with piercing eyes, he was regarded for his stamina and drive. He also was no stranger to death, as only 2 of his 5 children survived past the age of 4. In the summer of 1864, the regiment was called east from Louisiana to help repulse Early's near-successful raid on the U.S. capital. It was then assigned to the 19th Corps, 1st Division, when Sheridan took control of the Army of the Shenandoah in August of 1864. At the Federal September 19th victory at 3rd Winchester, the Green Mountain Boys clashed with a soon-to-be familiar foe, Gordon's division, holding their line for 2 hours amid a relentless firefight. Thomas then led a valiant bayonet charge, telling his men, "We'll drive 'em to hell." Implemented without orders from above, the charge was another block in Thomas's budding reputation as an inspirational leader. What Sheridan was to the army under him, Colonel Thomas was to his regiment, Howard wrote. Many had been the critical moments in our history when his level head and iron nerve had been our salvation. At Cedar Creek, with Thomas now in charge of the 2nd Brigade, command of the 8th Vermont was handed to Major John Boardman Meade, a 33-year-old father of 2. The undersized regiment did not hesitate in accepting the challenge of a showdown with Gordon, but as McFarland later wrote, it was a sacrifice to the god of war of the few that the many might be spared. The engagement with Gordon would last less than half an hour, many comparing the fighting to hell itself and the combatants to demons. After clawing their way uphill in the fog, the Vermonters entrenched in a wooded area. They were shocked, however, to see men in blue uniforms charging at them, whooping and hollering. Some of the Vermonters responded by opening fire. "Captain, we are firing on our own men," insisted Lieutenant Aaron K. Cooper, hunkered down next to McFarland. As McFarland replied, "I think not," Cooper, his guard down, was riddled with bullets. The men in bluecoats were indeed Confederates, benefactors of the raids on Union tents earlier in the attack. As the great drops of rain and hail preceded the hurricane, so now the laden hail filled the air, seemingly from all directions, recalled Private Abert E. Hill. Steadily pushed back, the 8th managed to reform in a ravine. McFarland, though, received news that Meade had been wounded, and Captain Edward Hall, his second-in-command, mortally wounded. The regiment was now in McFarland's hands. Hand-to-hand combat broke out. Men seemed more like demons than human beings, recalled Private Hill, as they struck fiercely at each other with clubbed muskets and bayonets. The fiercest struggle was for the 8th's colors. Corporal Alfred S. Warden had to fight off a bayonet attack by a stocky Confederate who was shot dead by a fellow Vermonter. Corporal John Petrie, holding the colors, would be mortally wounded, crying out as he fell to the ground, "Boys, leave me, take care of yourselves and the flag." But when fellow color guard Corporal Lyman F. Perman scooped up the colors, he was shot almost instantly. Engaged in what he called the boiling cauldron, where the fight for the colors was seething, Howard would be wounded twice, and later wrote that bayonets were literally dripping with blood amid the chaos, and that only one member of the color guard avoided being killed or wounded. It seemed as though we were passing into the very jaws of death, and that the gates of hell were open to receive us, McFarland wrote. Overrun and taking heavy losses, the Federals eventually had no choice but to fall back. Howard, one of his shoes filling with blood from a wound, heaped praise on those who continued to engage in brutal bayonet clashes. Although the regiment briefly reformed to try to halt the Confederate surge, it was fruitless. Longer resistance would have resulted in the regiment's entire death and capture, Meade wrote. It was indeed a horrific scene across the battlefield. Captain John W. DeForest of the 12th Connecticut recalled seeing pools of blood everywhere. The firm limestone soil would not receive it, he wrote, and there was no pitying summer grass to hide it. That sound you just heard means it's time for this week's book recommendation. This week's recommendation is The Guns of Cedar Creek by Thomas A. Lewis. The focus of this book becomes apparent right away, as each major player gets not just a mini-biography to help establish their backgrounds, but each gets a full chapter of their own. The first is on Confederate General Jubal Early, the second on his Union counterpart, General Phil Sheridan. These chapters fully establish their biographies, their battle histories, and the pressures they faced ahead of the clash at Cedar Creek. From here, subsequent chapters consist of dueling biographies of opposing officers who faced off at Cedar Creek. Custer versus Rozier, Crook versus Gordon, Lowell versus Ramseur. Ultimately, the entire first half of the book is essentially a set of biographies. Each individual's story is well told, and their rivalries well established, though by telling each individual's life story from its beginning to the cusp of Cedar Creek, and then starting all over again with the next biographical subject, the narrative continually backtracks in time just when it seems we're getting to the main event. One could be forgiven for getting halfway through the book and not even knowing that it's meant to be about the Battle of Cedar Creek. Eventually, though, we learn about the importance of the battle to come. Confederate control of the Shenandoah Valley gave them access to the fertile region's crops as well as an invasion route to the north. Union control would cut off a much-needed source of food for the Confederate forces, close their route to the north, and hem in General Lee's forces further to the east, giving him less room to maneuver as he faced off against General Grant. Once the key players' stories are established, the second half of the book finally focuses on the battle itself in an easy-to-follow account that focuses largely on the actions of the key players themselves and doesn't get too bogged down in tactics and maneuvers. What initially looked to be a Confederate victory was not to be, as Lewis writes of Sheridan's dramatic ride to the front from a meeting he was attending in Washington as the battle began, rallying his troops for a counterattack, winning the day, and seizing control of the Shenandoah for good. There's relatively little analysis of the general's performance or the importance of the battle's outcome, as the book returns to its biographical focus and ends with a long "whatever happened to everyone" epilogue, in which the main characters are variously relieved, disappointed, or deceased once the war comes to an end. From there, we follow each of the survivors through their post-war lives. So this is decidedly not a traditional battle history. The biographical first half of the book may make you wonder whether you're ever going to read anything about the battle itself. The lengthy biographical epilogue may make you forget that you just did. But the individual stories are absorbing, and the writing is compelling. So, in the end, after reading my share of Civil War battle books that do little more than describe in granular detail what happened, where, and when, I found this approach to this particular battle to be a welcome and refreshing take. So for those looking for more information about the combatants of Cedar Creek, this book is for you. As noted on the 8th Memorial at the Cedar Creek and Bella Haven National Historical Park, the regiment had 110 killed or wounded out of 164 engaged, including 13 of 16 commissioned officers. But was the horrible sacrifice worth it? Those who survived said yes, having brought critical time for their army to reform their ranks and launch its decisive counterattack. Recounted Hill, bleeding, stunned, and literally cut to pieces, but refusing to surrender colors or men, falling back only to prevent being completely encircled, the noble regiment had accomplished its mission. Incredibly, the 8th Vermont was not done fighting for the day. Howard was among those taken to a nearby field hospital, but Thomas took the lead in rallying the men, and, in what would long remain a contentious issue, the Confederate Army decided to halt its attack. According to Gordon, that was Early's call. The commander, he claimed, was satisfied enough with the morning's progress. Well, Gordon, this is glory enough for one day. This is the 19th. Precisely 1 month ago today, at 3rd Winchester, we were going in the opposite direction. By the end of the day, however, Confederate troops were again in retreat. Upon learning of Early's surprise attack, Sheridan had mounted his charger, Rienzi, and ridden furiously to the battlefield from Winchester. Sheridan's presence helped produce an inspired federal counterattack that broke the Confederate line and reestablished Union control of the battlefield. The 8th Vermont, freshly removed from the gates of hell, had a big hand in the counterattack, flipping the script against a familiar foe, Gordon's division. Thomas led the way, and even when his horse was killed under him, he remained galvanized. Now, under a bright sun, Early's army was driven from the battlefield. The Vermonters followed the Confederates as far as Strasburg, about 4 miles. Most, unfortunately, would spend a difficult night without blankets, tents, or fires. Cedar Creek marked the regiment's last major action of the war. From that point on, it served mainly in a defensive role in the valley. Thomas received a Medal of Honor for his efforts in the battle, formally recognized for distinguished conduct in a desperate hand-to-hand encounter in which the advance of the enemy was checked. Thomas became a Republican and re-entered politics after the war, serving as Vermont's lieutenant governor and in various other political and business positions before his death in 1903 at the age of 94. McFarland dedicated himself to repairing buildings and locations that had been damaged during the war before he died at 89 in 1911. Howard died in 1912 at the age of 72. Cedar Creek was essentially the final major blow for the Confederacy in the valley, but in reality, Jubal Early wasn't quite finished yet. For the Vermont soldiers, the battle was probably their most celebrated day. A large painting by Civil War veteran Julian Scott, hanging prominently in the State House in Montpelier, depicts the 1st Vermont Brigade's counterattack. It features members of the 8th Vermont, including Thomas, visible in the background. Meade recovered from his Cedar Creek wound, and in his official report to the adjutant general in September of 1865, he acknowledged the regiment's record and bravery and fearlessness. I hope I may not be charged with egotism when I say the 8th Regiment was not excelled by any other in service and devotion to the cause for which it was raised, in its readiness and willingness to meet all necessary exposure and danger incident to a soldier's life. It's your history. Learn it, know it, love it. Like and follow so you don't miss any of the exciting episodes from Mad Hatter's Civil War history.